And so thanks to Andrew, who asked me to talk about Mokuhanga, which seems like, but we're the Canadian Letterpress Alliance. Why would that be of relevance? I will get to that. I found a way to make it relevant. But some of you may know I went to Japan last year and learned Mokuhanga, which is something that a lot of people here don't really know about. So it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about. How did I find out about Mokuhanga? Through the podcast, The Unfinished Print. And I always give Andre credit because I know one of his goals in starting that podcast was to, create awareness and maybe get more people interested in making Mokuhanga. And so I always tell him, I heard him actually in an interview once saying, if I can just get one new person who wants to make Mokuhanga because of, these interviews I'm doing, I will have done my job. And I always tell him, well, you've done your job and then some. So Andre started The Unfinished Print in 2020. He lives in Toronto. Andrew knows him really well too. Do you know him, George?
No.
Because he's not a printmaker. So he was a ukiyo-e print collector who decided, I think basically during the pandemic, like he started the podcast in 2020. He's a print collector. He has artists in his family, but not an artist himself, and thought, maybe it'd be really cool to learn how to make these prints. Just like anything, we appreciate what we see when we've actually tried our hand at making it ourselves and understand the process better. So he started, and he had some previous podcasting experience. So I guess that made it easier for him to start this up. And he basically, has dedicated this podcast, The Unfinished Print, specifically to Mokuhanga. And Mokuhanga artists and gallerists and collectors and curators and, anybody involved in creating, promoting, and preserving it as a unique art form, because Mokuhanga is, and Akemi, feel free to, I'm not going to use too many Japanese words, but Mokuhanga, my understanding, means wood printing. And it was a term that was first started to be used in the 20th century when Japan, after its 200 years of isolation, opened to the world. They started using the term Mokuhanga to help distinguish the Japanese water-based woodblock prints from the woodcut prints being created in Europe. So how are they similar and different? Our Western woodcut prints that we would be more familiar with here compared to the Japanese woodblock prints. So Western woodblock prints, we know there are multi-block prints where in theory each color has its own block. There's generally a key block, but not always. There's also reduction printing where there's only one block and you carve and print and carve more and print, and it's literally reduced during the process. And Picasso really popularized that. The Japanese woodblock prints are traditionally multi-block with that key block. The Western prints, generally it was my understanding that, and it certainly is now, but that it was one person, the artist, doing all parts of the process. However, George educated us this morning, not always the case with wood engravings. William Blake was an example you gave, that he was the artist, he could do engraving, but it was a little bit subpar, so he would give his drawing to an engraver who would engrave. And then there would maybe be another printer as well. So that was new to me. I didn't really realize that same sort of system was maybe involved in the Western tradition of printmaking. Certainly, historically in Japan, there was a 4-part system because Mokuhanga was part of the media for the masses. And so it was generally, the publisher who was orchestrating the whole system. Publisher would hire an artist, this is called the Henmoto system. The publisher would hire an artist to do a drawing, a painting, which would then be passed off to the carvers. That original drawing or painting was called the henshita. It would be pasted face down to the block, and that's what the carver would then use as their guidelines for carving that block to the artist's specifications. The key block, once carved, would be printed by printers. So the carvers only ever carved and the printers only ever printed, and they never considered themselves artists. The original illustrator was the artist, but that's how the Japanese elevated their woodblock printing to such a high standard, because they had real experts doing each stage of the process. So that was really interesting. That was a new thing that I learned about there. We're very familiar in Western woodblock printmaking. The V parting tool is often what's used for the outline. You want a wider base to your relief printing surfaces for stability. And it's my understanding that the V parting tool was the Western invention because, of course, we're always trying to speed things up. The Japanese the Japanese use the hangito knife. So that was a new tool that I learned when I was in Japan, where you're carving on an angle to the outside of the area you want to maintain, that you want to print, but then you have to come back and carve the other side of that V trench. And so instead of carving one side and the other, the V removes the whole trench at once. Of course, clearing more materials, more pressure on the wood, more prone to tearing if your tools aren't sharp. So this was really great. This really severs the grain. And so that was really useful for me to learn. Western woodcut, I mean, the Japanese, they are known for using cherry, and certainly mountain cherry wood, and specifically for the key blocks, it's a very hard wood, so it withstands a lot of printing. Whereas for the color blocks, they might have used magnolia as one of the woods, or katsura. I would assume in Europe, I don't know specifically, but again, it's like, what is your local wood, right? This is where George is now using maple instead of boxwood because it's readily available here in Canada. That's kind of always been the case, I think, for most materials. And of course, now we can order things from other places. But Western woodblock printing is generally working with oil-based inks, and also, this is partly how I got interested in Mokuhanga. When I learned about it through the podcast, I was already starting to use a lot of transparent extender with my oil-based inks and overprinting to create new colors. And so I realized, okay, oil-based ink adding transparent extender. The Japanese don't use oil-based inks, they use water-based pigment. Originally would have been from powdered organic and minerals and mixed with water, as well as nori, which is a starch paste. And these are mixed together right on the block, and it's naturally translucent. So that same overprinting can be utilized to create new colors. Whereas the oil-based ink is applied with a brayer, the water-based pigments are applied with very specialized horsehair brushes. They come in varying sizes depending on the color area and the size of the block, like little tiny things versus big blocks. And what I really love about this is, the same size brush, but look at the different color of the hair. They come from real horses. It's like the tail hair, a mane hair of horses. And there's a whole special process of you actually purposely split the ends to soften it up, and you have to singe it in a cast iron frying pan and then rub it on shark skin, which I really did do. Now that I'm home, I have my cast iron frying pan and sandpaper, so I can do that. So you can kind of get that nice rounded edge to not leave streaks in your pigment. But those block brushes, Marubake, come in a variety of sizes too. So that's how it's applied right on the wood block, which is damp, versus Western is dry wood, oil-based ink. Japanese is damp wood, water-based pigment, printed on damp washi, the handmade Japanese paper made from kozo. When you hear people talk about mulberry paper, kozo is paper mulberry. So the kozo and mulberry are the same thing, but also Mitsumata and Gampi are two other fibers. In theory, they're trees, but they don't grow to the size of our trees, but they are woody like that. And the fibers they use are actually the inside, the interior bark. They have to peel off there's a whole long process, which we won't get into.
Fiber.
It's the inner bast fiber. Okay, I didn't know that word, bast, but they do peel off the outer bark. So it's like a very specialized technique to get that. Whereas in Europe, they were of course making the heavy cotton rag paper because they had lots of these old cotton rags, and they figured out how to make that into paper. Whereas in Japan, they had all these small trees. And the thing with the kozo, it's very, it grows like 2 or 3 meters a year or something. It's very renewable. Mitsumata less so, and Gampi much less so. And they haven't been able to even cultivate Gampi successfully still. So they're still foraging it wild on the mountainside, which is why it's so expensive. And there's less and less of it. Exactly. It's getting harder and harder to find. In Western woodblock, with your multi-block, generally the key block is printed last to hide any minor misregistrations between the color blocks, whereas the Japanese tradition, they printed the key block first in often a lighter color, and that would often have been with sumi ink, which is what they use for their black. Paper registration in Western, done in a variety of ways on a press, whereas with Mokuhanga, you've got kento notches cut right into the wood, so it's embedded in the block. And then when you register your image to the other blocks, those kento notches have to always be in the same place. So again, often you're working from the key block or from a drawing that you're then able to, often I'm transferring with carbon paper, which George alluded to, but I also use the pasting method, using nori paste for your original drawing, or even a photocopy you can use as your original image, and pasting it down with the nori. And then once you've got your key block, taking prints of that and using, those are called kyogo, and they get pasted to the color blocks. So that's all sort of part of the planning. And also, that's the embedded kento, the traditional way, but people have devised like a floating kento, particularly beneficial when you have a very small block and you don't want to, you can see you need quite a bit of a border when you've got the embedded kento. So you can just put this there. And I thought it was really cool when I was in Japan. They have some of these like kento stickers.
No way.
So you could have a wood block and carve your kento in. But if you think you might want to use this floating kento block for different prints that maybe have different sized borders, you can imagine if you're cutting into it every time, you're going to need to get a new block eventually. But with these stickers, you can just place them. It's always an L in the corner. And what are they each called, George? I forget. Do you remember? I can't remember off the top of my head the name. The two.
The kento band, is that correct?
Yeah, but the actual. The L in the corner and the straight, they have different names, and off the top of my head I don't remember. But anyway, so those were really cool stickers in order to use a floating kento, particularly beneficial with smaller blocks, but definitely it is much more accurate to have the embedded kento when it's registered properly. And yes, so Western style, we know we can hand print in a variety of ways, but generally it was press printed, whereas Japanese prints are always hand printed with a bamboo baron. And, there are a variety of grades of bamboo baron. I have some very, cheap $10 student grade bamboo barons from Jackson's, which are great for like workshops and things like that. But, when I was at my residency in Japan, they gave us like basically all the basic tools, and like, you can get barons that cost thousands of dollars. These ones are more like $50, which is still much superior to the student grade ones. But you can feel the coil of bamboo underneath the bamboo sheath. And so it's those nubbies of this braided bamboo coil inside. That's what helps apply that additional friction. So there are different grades as well. There's a fine, this is the strong, so it's even more nubby. And somebody was mentioning the ball bearing baron earlier at Kemi. And so I've never used one, but again, it's got, imagine those metal balls in there. It's for even stronger pressure. So I haven't used one, but I have had situations where I thought I could use more pressure. Maybe one day I'm gonna have to get one of those. Now the lightest pressure are these plastic ones, just little nubbies, and there are different types of, this is one of the real exciting things I find with the Japanese prints, is that it seems like there's almost a greater variety of the techniques that can be achieved through the printing. And in fact, at my residency, they really encouraged us, stay simple with your carving. We think of ukiyo-e and those fine lines and very, very detailed. They're like, just don't worry so much about carving fine details. Focus more on the potential in the printed, the possibilities when printing. So very light texture, very light pressure, you can create kind of a gomazuri effect where it's more of a speckly look. Like, do you see this background hill there is kind of speckly? That's done on purpose. Allows more of what's behind it to come through, kind of speckly, versus, the very flat color areas. That's called betazuri. And then when you're making a gradient, you can see I actually did print, this was a gradient that I had two brushes blended, one brush blended. So that's a two-color gradient versus, my dark to light gradient, which actually would have been printed 2 or 3 times to build up that intensity of the gradient. Gradient is bokashi, is the Japanese term, versus we say gradients in English. What else do I have that I can show you? It's very fine, but I tried to capture some wood grain in the sky here, and that's called mokumezuri. When you actually see some of the wood grain, which to me is one of the reasons I really love printing from wood, is I want to capture the look of the natural materials that I'm using. A little bit of embossing here. Karazuri is embossing. So it was often used in the Japanese prints, for example, in areas of the kimono, certainly in an area that's white. You see the embossed textures more, and that has to be taken into consideration when carving. So that was something. And one thing I did here, which I think might be sort of a more contemporary variation from previously wax, might have been dripped onto the wood blocks to create it kind of resist. One of our teachers showed us about using water-based varathane. And so I've actually painted it on. And actually, if you do 1 or 2 or 3 layers, it kind of gets smoother. And that's how you can create, you see the bark? How I've created texture and tonal values, not by carving, but in fact, by applying this varathane. And not only does the varathane, yeah, you can feel the texture. I've not carved, I've painted the varathane on. Not only does the varathane resist this was all sumi ink, by the way. 5 blocks, 13 impressions of different dilutions of sumi ink. So not only does the sumi repel from the varathane, but you can use like a Q-tip and wipe it away and then get some additionally lighter areas. So that I think is derived from the original use of wax. So there's a lot of really innovative things. You know, of course, with oil-based ink, we still can do flat color. We still can do gradients. We can do a la poupée spot coloring, using masks to block out areas, carving marks for texture. But with the printing of the Japanese prints, you're changing a lot of those textures just by the way you're printing. More water, less water, more pressure, less pressure, and being, so there's a lot of experimentation. So anyways, the podcast was how I found out about, and I started thinking about the ways that I could use it, what I was already trying to do in my relief prints, and how it could be beneficial to me, and maybe was in alignment with my values of using natural materials, being more environmentally friendly. And the podcast itself, if you're interested in learning more about Mokuhanga, I had stumbled on it just because I was looking for podcasts about printmaking, just wanting to keep learning about more kinds of printmaking and hearing directly from artists about their process. But it's really becoming, since 2020, and he's still doing interviews every couple of months now. So, we're in our 6th year now. It's becoming an important resource because it's like international. He's interviewing people from around the world, either, sometimes historians talking about historical Mokuhanga or people who are contemporary printmakers now. And so it's just really giving a lot of insight and becoming a good resource. But time and again in listening, I did in 2024, I discovered the podcast, which had been running since 2020. I did like a deep dive and like really binged on the podcast, and I kept hearing over and over again all these printmakers saying they had learned at MILAB, the Mokuhanga Innovation Laboratory, and it was a 5-week program. And I started looking into it and realized everywhere else it's 1 or 2 weeks. Okay, we're printmakers and we know what can you really get out of 1 or 2 weeks, and not a lot. And I thought 5 weeks, okay, if I want to learn this is the place to go. So I applied in 2020. By the end of 2024, I was applying and I got accepted, and I ended up going in the spring of 2025 and had a fabulous time. Happened to be there. Actually, I want to just quickly explain, it's not a lot, but just a few dates in terms of MILAB itself. It began, its initial iteration was the Nagasawa Art Park, and it was located in Awaji City, which I think Awaji is an island, founded by Keiko Kadota and Yasuyuki Sato. Keiko was the artist, and Yasuyuki Sato-san was the businessman. So they were business partners. He already had a vested interest in historical Japanese tradition, techniques, things that were being lost with the progression of technology, as we've talked about already in a variety of ways this morning. And so their vision was to host international artists, printmakers, and teachers of printmaking, and to introduce them to the tools and techniques of Mokuhanga, basically to help keep the art form alive. So in 1997 is when they first began this program, and they started out by inviting accomplished printmakers from around the world. So it was by like selection that you got to go to the Nagasawa Art Park. And the artists who went there got to experience like life in like traditional Japanese life in a Japanese village. You know, they had a lot of interaction with the local people and had the opportunity to work and meet and work with other international artists during the residency, which again, in these podcast interviews, I was hearing how that was like the impetus for a lot of lifelong friendships and artistic collaborations as well. It was a really powerful experience. So in the 12 years of the Nagasawa Art Park, 1997 to 2011, they had 78 artists from 30 different countries participate in that program and then go home to their countries and start teaching people in their own countries about Mokuhanga. They also made a point of supporting the other Japanese craft traditions that were related to Mokuhanga, such as a deep understanding and appreciation for washi, the handmade Japanese paper. And we've got the Japanese paper place here. You know, Nancy's been doing that work for a long, long time as well. But it's also quite different when you get to go to Japan and see them making it and even participate in it. And that is what was traditionally used for Mokuhanga to be printed on. In 2011, the Nagasawa Art Park then succeeded to the Mokuhanga Innovation Laboratory, the current name, and they relocated from Awaji City to Lake Kawaguchi, which was near Tokyo, and apparently from the photos and what I hear from people had an incredible view of Mount Fuji. So very inspiring right by the lake. They expanded their programming, so they now had, you know, they had done their pilot program at Nagasawa Art Park, and now they had like a beginner, intermediate, and advanced program. So people who'd already been could come back and learn from different Japanese instructors, different techniques, and keep expanding their learning. So really making a real program of it. In 2011, Keiko Kadota also initiated, they've got a triannual International Mokuhanga Conference, and the first one took place in Kyoto. In 2000, and then the second one, I think, would have been in 2014. In 2017, Keiko Kadota died. I think she had cancer, but she was the real, I hear that, from what I hear, she was a real fireball. So she was the real driving force behind MILAB. And so that, I think, probably threw MILAB into a bit of uncertainty. How is this going to carry forward? But by then, they'd already been growing this community of artists who had been studying there, you know, for a couple of decades already at that point. And there was enough of a foundation that they found a way to keep moving forward. By 2020, they made a decision to relocate, even though it was in such an amazing location by Mount Fuji. You know, the artists loved that. But they kept finding the artists coming wanted to learn more and more about the washi, because it's such a critical part of the prints. It's hard to see when they're in sleeves, but you know, the paper itself, especially when it's thinner paper, not only is the water-based pigment translucent, but so is the paper. And it's always been a characteristic feature of Mokuhanga prints that you can see the image from the back too. Because unlike the oil-based ink, you know, building up the layers, you can literally feel the texture of the built-up layers of oil-based ink. Because with the Japanese prints, you're printing water-based ink on damp paper, the pigment becomes embedded right in the paper. And there's this luminosity, you know, a real atmospheric effect that I loved the aesthetic of as well when I made the decision I wanted to learn more about it. So the paper being such a critical component, and knowing that there are different kinds of fibers that can be used, there are different thicknesses of washi, they wanted to learn more about it. And of course, you know, the artists who were participating, some of them were using washi already in other different ways, and being in Japan wanted to have a more direct experience of it. So by moving to etches in Tokyo, where it was before, that's the Lake Kawaguchiko, was still like 3 hours by high-speed train. So it wasn't really feasible to be doing a day trip there. You know, they may have done that, but then just realized it's too much to fit into their program from that distance. So by relocating to Echizen in Fukui Prefecture, it was one of the original, most important paper-making areas. And so, and they have a washi village there. Unlike Awagami, a lot of us know about Awagami. They have done a really great job of international marketing, you know, again with the marketing and how critical that is and getting the word out. They've got an amazing team and an amazing establishment where they're able to host people coming in to actually make washi there. But, you know, there's a lot of other places around the country where, it's supply and demand. The demand, washi used to be used for everything. They're making their houses, printing their banknotes. It was on handmade paper, right? And then as things modernized, there was less demand. And also the children said, this is way too much work. They are farmers. It's so the young people moving to the cities, right? We have the same issues in our farming communities here too. And so there were less people to do the work. So Etchison, their washi village, has really been even though it was one of the most important areas originally, people don't have the same didn't have the same awareness of it because they're older. Their younger children have decided not to carry on the family business. When I went there, we're talking 80-year-old Japanese couples in their garage with their hands in cold water all day. So dedicated to, what we see as an art. For them, it's craft. They're, again, like technicians, like the carvers and printers. It's like their job. So they moved to Etchison so that they could give the artists coming to the residency a better firsthand experience of the paper making. Etchison is also renowned for its production of other traditional crafts, such as pottery. There's a pottery village. There's a knife village. There's whole little villages built around those craft industries because they had one knife workshop where it was like a cooperative where everybody would come and use the same equipment, and work on their own things. And lacquerware also. But of course, washi was the most important, and hosho from Etchison Village was very, very highly regarded. Another special thing about Etchison, which was a bonus to them moving there and a bonus to me going to the residency in that springtime frame, it's home to the Okamoto Ataki Shrine, which is the home shrine of the goddess of paper making, Kawakami Gozen. And so I was there for the paper making festival the first weekend of May, and that was quite exciting to see them carry the Makoshi, the portable shrine, up the mountain to collect her spirit and bring it back down. And then you've got 3 or 4 days of music. They literally have children dressed up reenacting the whole mythic, experience of Kawakami Gozen coming and teaching the farmers how to make paper in the wintertime so that when they couldn't farm in the wintertime, they had a way to still make a living. So they have all these kids reenacting the whole thing with music. And it's the washi village, the paper makers themselves who put on this festival every year. They're drumming, music is a big part of it, and dance. So that was an amazing cultural experience that I got to enjoy. So the programming, though, of course, they moved during 2020, so it was kind of interrupted by the pandemic. 2023, they got things going again for the first time now in Etchison, and I was there in 2025, so they're still getting established there, but people are now starting to get used to these international, it's a Japanese village, there is not a lot of English, whereas in the big cities, the signs are in English and everything. This is you're out in the countryside when you get to Etchison. It's on the opposite side of the island from Tokyo, and so it was really cool, and people were so interested, though. They wanted to talk to us. They wanted to know more about why we were there and what we were learning. And we got to, at the end of our 5 weeks, we had an open house and welcomed, anybody in the community could come in, the people from the bar, the people from the grocery store, our neighbors. We actually had NHK, the Japan national broadcaster, came to film it and decided to interview me because I happened to have chosen to be inspired by some of the things I was seeing in Japan and had some Japanese imagery, and they were quite taken with it. And I had people come up to me and say, wow, Japanese lanterns, we have them everywhere. I don't really look at them. I've never thought of them as art before. And to me, that was a huge compliment and really shows too what bringing in international artists to their little village can do for them and helping them see their own culture in a new way, I think they also liked that my imagery was more representational. They could identify with it. They're saying a lot of the artists coming are much more abstract, right? And not that the Japanese artists aren't as well, but I think that there was a more direct relationship for the older people in the community could identify, they could see, some of their culture in it, and they really were very pleased with that. It's also been really amazing for the paper makers because they've been making and shipping paper around the world for a long time, but they ship it off and then they keep making more paper. Now they're seeing what people are doing with their washi, and it's really inspiring for them to continue on the tradition, and hopefully maybe inspiring for the younger people that there is interest. People do want washi, and can show them that, yeah, like look at all the things that are being done with it, and hearing firsthand the appreciation from the printmakers taking part in the residency. So and they are often printed more than once, so that he's printing 12 to like 20 color layers. But I've heard of printmakers who are like printing, there was one guy, it was like 83 color layers. And it was like, oh my God, what? Like, how long does that take? And like the patience, right? Like the stamina that requires, and like not getting sick of what you're working on. So, you know, it can take 3 to 4 hours to print one color of his edition. I noticed on his website, his editions range from 30 to 50 prints, keeping in mind like that the ukiyo printers, like they printed a minimum of 200. And if they printed, and if there was a lot of demand, they would print more. If the blocks were out, they would carve new blocks and keep printing. They were not editioned, right? Unlike the Western prints, which traditionally were editioned. So anyways, 3 to 4 hours for one color of the edition, 12 to 20 colors. So we're talking a couple weeks just to print the colors. But you don't have to wait for like a week for the oil-based color to dry. You know, you can kind of continue, or just take it out overnight, put it back, dampen it again the next day. So he's really known for these fantastical kind of storybook images, like you saw, like this kind of image where he's kind of creating a whole new world every time he's creating a print. And he really tries to not be so worried about the little mistakes, which inevitably happen, that he's really more interested in like the spirit of the work and the feelings it's going to evoke in the viewer. And he's very like, he's a teacher also, and does some mentoring, I think, and he also has like a Patreon thing where he's got some video tutorials. And so he talks a lot about the creative process, and you know how he feels like the patience that it cultivates. It's like helping him learn to be a better person, right? And developing a greater understanding of himself and the world around him through this constant observation. But really, he foremost is a storyteller. And this goes back to like when he was making his own books and writing poetry and stories. Apparently, he's kind of always told himself stories, and always when he has looked at artwork, kind of created a narrative. And now he's got 3 daughters, and he's telling them these stories that he is inventing. So that is like part of his fabric as a person, and that's where this way of working has really resonated with him. And he feels like, so this could get what some people would consider a little woo-woo, but he really feels like he is not in control of the process, that he is just getting out of his own way. And you know, he's got these ideas in his sketchbook, and he chooses one that he feels like the right time for that idea, and is willing to invest the time to see where it will lead him, and let's it just come through him. So, you know, he's taking the world in, you know, with his eyes, and like filtering it through his experience before it comes back out, and then it kind of takes on a life of its own. He feels like it's like a journey for him. He doesn't always know where it's going to go. And the text comes last. So he does, it's not, you might think maybe he starts with the text, but in fact, the text doesn't come till after the image is done, and the image speaks to him about what it wants to say. Yes?
What about your process? Do you believe that how much of the external world impacts your final piece, and how much do you direct? Do you feel that you're in control of the final work?
Yes, I will admit most of my work is based on my own photographs of capturing moments that have significant impact on me, often like emotionally, and that can be like the color of the clouds. So I'm like, oh my God, you know, like I've always been an observer, and I often notice things like the texture of the grass that the people around me are like, what are you talking about, you know? And so I take a lot of photos when we're on canoe trips or hiking or things like that. And they're the images that stick with me. I'm like, I think I have a photo of that, and I use that as my reference. And it helps me capture those fleeting colors, you know, that are sometimes like a really strong part of that experience. So in my work, which is largely influenced by nature and my more and more my experience of landscape, I would say, is what inspires me. And I guess it's a way to hold on to those special moments. So I feel like I am orchestrating it. Like I feel like it's interesting because people are like, oh, you're just making it from a photograph. Well, if anybody's ever tried, it's not quite that straightforward. And not to mention, like, all that you're talking about, how long did it take? Well, how many years have I been studying art and looking at the world and making concentrated decisions, concerted decisions in the composition of the photos I even take, and the what I saw that I thought was worthy of even taking, those, it all builds up, right? So, and then I deviate from that too, of course, but yeah, so I feel like I'm pretty in control of the imagery, but like not necessarily the process, especially in this new medium. And the water is like the biggest challenge, like knowing how much. They said, well, it's like, well, how damp does the paper need to be? And they said, well, hodo, just right. Okay, so that's what's going to take a lifetime to figure out, is like, what is the right amount of moisture? So anyways, I thought it was really fascinating. And he's not, I was listening to Bennett's talk that you posted, the Trent University interview, which was really super interesting. Again, hearing other artists talk about their process, which is why I'm sharing so much of this, because it helps you visualize where does this come from, because we all work in such different ways. And it was great to hear Bennett talk about his work, and he made comment about so many letterpress printer, myself included in his comment, printing quotes and things that, words that feel inspirational, that resonate with me personally, is the quotes that I choose to print. And then other people are like, oh my gosh, that speaks so strongly. Like, I believe that, as well. And how, so he was kind of saying, I don't know if he necessarily thinks that's a good thing, but it's certainly one big use of letterpress in like our contemporary times right now. But this is his own words, but he feels like the story gave him these words, right? So the text coming after the image, that the image can stand alone on its own, but he understands how the viewer's experience of the image is often different and more surface. If it's just the image, that maybe they'll acknowledge, oh, look at that cute bear with the parachute. What a funny thing. Or they might look at the craftsmanship and how it's been made, but like not really take the time to consider the narrative that he's trying to create. And that's where he feels like the words that he adds encourages the viewer to spend a little bit longer contemplating what's really going on here. What's who is this artist behind the work? And so he feels like, he sees the text as like the latch to open the window. It's like an access point for the viewer to spend a little bit longer. You read the text and then you experience the image is what his hope is. At first he used black text, and he sets his text by hand, and he has a very small personal collection also. A small point size. I would have guessed like maybe the type was like 14 point or something, would you have said? Mm-hmm. So generally small, generally serif is what's his preference is in terms of what he feels is legible. He used to use black text, but as a designer, he didn't like how much attention the black text commanded, how distracting it was from these very colorful images. So what he started doing now is he prints with like a light blue, often a transparent light blue, and brushes gold powder on it. And so they're these very subtle, he says like akin to gold foil, but even more subtle, because they're very like 14 point. They're very delicate, usually a very delicate typeface. He just doesn't, people have complained, why do you make it so hard to read the text? But he just doesn't want it to be the first thing you see. He wants, and because his work isn't super big, you step in a bit closer and then you're like, oh, now that I step to the side, I notice there's some text there. Like, so that it's more subtle, it kind of draws you in. You have to be kind of standing at the right angle with the light hitting it the right way to even be able to read it, which draws you in. And then now that they've looked at the image, but then they've seen the text, they're like, wait a minute, and they look again, and they think again. So that's sort of where he's gone with that. And traditionally, some Japanese prints did contain text, but like that wasn't a defining factor. Again, it was media for the masses, and with the Japanese prints, it really was the water-based pigments that set them apart from other kinds of printmaking. So he's been working, I don't know exactly when he started doing Mokuhanga, but he was a speaker at the second International Mokuhanga Conference in 2014. So he has been doing this for a long time. He just really feels like Mokuhanga is helping him to grow as a person, and it's allowing him to make these these stories, these visual stories, which are really part of the fabric of who he is as a person who's always been a storyteller. And he wants to create conversation between people and help build relationships. And as a teacher, he just, because of this experience he's gone through, he's really encouraging younger people and anybody who's starting out that just to make sure you're making art, making prints that reflect who you are as a person. You know, those of us who like sell our prints, sometimes you get caught in that thing where you're like, oh, I notice people are buying more of this kind of thing. Maybe I should make more of that kind of thing. But that's such a trap, because we have to really love what we do to invest the time in what we do. And often you go down that path and either you're not loving what you're making anymore, or it doesn't sell anyways because people feel that you didn't love making it as much, right? Exactly what we talked about. And so that's exactly what he says too, you know, because there's your hand is directly involved in every stage of the process, that energy does get captured there, and people do feel it. Now, I've probably talked even longer than George. I'm not good at being concise, and I'm equally passionate about this and the new things that I've learned. And I thought it was really cool to see. I love this idea of how we can use different kinds of print mediums together. You know, that's something I've been interested in too. He does have a documentary that one time at an opening, a young filmmaker came up and said, I'd really love to make a documentary about you. And so they did do that. And I don't know, there was it's 23 minutes long, but there was a segment, I thought if there was interest, it could be after lunch, but or I could just give you the name of it. It's called Story Print, and it's on his website, which for people at home is fablewood.com. Andy Farkas, Farkas. You can Google him also to watch that video, which really, in the video, he tells a story. And while he's telling the story, he's doing all the parts of the process. You see him working on his challenge proof, setting type, working on his challenge proof press, dusting the gold powder. So you can kind of brings the process to life as well. One other documentary I would like to recommend, which I thought was so beautiful and to me really captures what I see as the poetic nature of Mokuhanga, this really, for those of us who are interested in that side of our experience as printmakers or artwork. Mary Broadbeck, another American. There are not a lot of Canadians working in Mokuhanga. Elizabeth Forrest, we mentioned. Andre Zadarozny is making some prints. There are a few people around who are making Mokuhanga. Dan Starling in BC, who I met at the Impact Conference in the fall. He teaches at UBC. He's been learning Mokuhanga. There's not a lot of us in Canada.
And the printer.
And George makes some Mokuhanga.
The printer of Mary Pratt's work. He's in BC.
And I don't know
He's a Japanese
too much about
man.
him. You mentioned.
He does 90 colors.
Okay, and maybe that's who Dan was learning from, actually.
Yeah, and
okay.
He reproduced all Mary Pratt's paintings like this big.
Okay.
And those woodcuts are mind-boggling. Tom Smart wrote a piece about him in one of the Devil's Artisans.
Okay.
About the work of, and I can't remember his name.
No, I don't know either.
But a master.
Okay, master printer.
A master at the
Okay. Well, Mary Broadbeck, Brodbeck, used to make films before she got into printmaking. And so she actually made this documentary about her own process, and she studied in Japan. And so she goes back and she reconnects with her teacher, and her work is, I love her work because it's also very inspired by nature, by landscape, beautiful use of color. And her film is called Becoming Made. And it is very poetic, and for me really captured the beauty of the process. So those are two things, anybody interested in self-study and a little bit of visual to go along with what I've said today, I would recommend those two documentaries. Yeah. So I think that's about it. Are there any other questions?
Oh, wonderful.